Hello everyone, my name is Ken Moragori. I'm a verbal trainer with the Kenya Lift program GMAT training. So today we'll be handling assumption questions and critical reasoning. So this is one of the questions that usually have a conclusion or argument, and we said that more than half of CR is conclusion or argument based. So this means that the passage will contain a conclusion, a reasoning to that conclusion, and a premise or a build-up to that conclusion. So assumption questions are similar to strengthening the argument questions in that the answer kind of strengthens that conclusion, but the difference is that without the assumption being true, or if the assumption is false, the conclusion falls apart. So this means that an assumption is needed for the conclusion to be valid. So as with all other conclusion questions, the strategy is still the same. You identify the conclusion of argument, and then you identify the reasoning behind it. So why did the author conclude that way? And then you use process of elimination to eliminate all wrong answers till one valid choice is left. So if we dive specifically into conclusion, we want to make sure that we are thinking critically. So that is, you evaluate every option independently. Once you read an answer choice, you just ask yourself, what exactly is this answer choice saying relative to my conclusion? Then be aware of modifiers and their usage. So do not ignore any modifier, or do not assume that any is unimportant. So always ask yourself, is this interpretation mine or the author's? Because if you always make sure that you are using your author's reasoning, you will find that actually the whole of critical reasoning will get easier for you. So understanding is key. So make sure you understand the passage, you understand where the author is coming from and why they concluded that way. So that way you can easily find your assumption. So be careful of the seemingly unimportant choices. Think, does this affect the conclusion? So you may find that an answer choice is saying something that seems irrelevant or seems out of scope. But just think through it and ask yourself if that specific answer choice affects the conclusion. So you have an example of a very simple assumption. So you have one statement that the flower is pink. Second statement is roses are pink. So you have a flower. So say it's an anonymous flower, it's pink, and then you know that roses are pink. Then you have here your conclusion that the flower is a rose. So for this case, if you are asked to find the assumption, so remember that first of all, you find the conclusion. So the flower is a rose. Then you ask yourself, why? So why did the author conclude this way? It's because the flower is pink and we know roses are pink. So the author decided that the flower is a rose. And then you go to your answer choices and you find such an answer choice, carnation, the only other pink flower, has recently been declared extinct. So this, of course, because we're talking about roses, you may think that this is out of scope. But again, we said, just think if this affects the conclusion at all. So we have carnations, which are type of a flower, and they are the only other pink flower. So this means that we have roses and carnations as pink flower, but in this case, carnation has recently been declared extinct. So that means if you see a pink flower, it's most definitely a rose. So you can see that this assumption strengthens this conclusion. And if this assumption is not true, say that the carnation is not extinct, it's still, well, it's not extinct, that means that this flower can either be a rose or a carnation. So that means that if this assumption was flipped or if it wasn't true, then the conclusion falls apart. So that's what we are saying is the difference between strengthening a conclusion and finding an assumption. So we have the negation test. So this is fetching the opposite of the assumption to determine if it weakens the argument. So if the argument or conclusion is weakened, you may have found your assumption. Because we are saying if the assumption, and notice that we say assumption in quotes because it's a potential assumption, so it's in the answer choices. So if you take that answer choice and negate it, or you make it opposite of whatever it's saying, it's supposed to weaken the conclusion. So if we go to our previous example, and here we say that carnations, the only pink flower, has recently been declared, say, of danger of extinction. So we know for sure that carnations are not extinct. So that means that if you negate your assumption and it results to the conclusion being weakened, you've probably found the assumption. So, but this is tricky because as you can see, we haven't really taken has and negated to hasn't, which would work, but it kind of doesn't make sense because you can say carnation, the only other pink flower, hasn't recently been declared extinct. So negation has its own problems, and we'll see them here. So one, it's difficult to execute in complex statements or the statements that have subtle choices. So these also include where it's possible to have multiple different negations. And you've seen in our example, our ability to negate depended on understanding. We are saying here conclusion and reasoning, but it also requires an understanding of that assumption statement. So whatever statement that you are negating, make sure that you understand the essence of it, such that you are easily able to derive the negative statement that relates to that. So good mastery of the right technique usually removes the need for negation test. So if you develop your process well, and you can clearly be able to tell how a possible assumption is affecting the conclusion, you do not even need the negation test. So that being said, we can move on to our example today. So just pause and try it by yourself, pick an answer, and then unpause the video, then we'll discuss. So we have, in order to finance road repairs, the Highway Commission of a certain state is considering a 50% increase in the 10 cents per mile toll for vehicles using its toll highway. The Highway Commissioner claims that the toll increase will increase the annual revenue generated by the toll highway by at least 50% per year. Which of the following is an assumption on which the Highway Commissioner's claim depends? So, first of all, number one, what's the conclusion of or this claim? So the claim is that claims that the toll increase, so toll increase will increase the annual revenue generated by the toll highway by at least 50%. So will result to an increase in annual revenue. So we say once you know what conclusion the author has, you ask yourself why. So why? Because a 50% increase result to more revenue, because if someone was paying, say, $100, they will be paying $150. So you see, this 50% increase results to a 50% increase in revenue, and it's at least. So we have a conclusion and why the order is reasoning that way. So we have some information that we have left out. So in order to finance road repairs, so this is the reason why this commissioner wants the state to increase the toll by 50%. So which of the following is an assumption on which the highway commissioner's claim depend? So A, so we have A, B, C, D, and E. So A, the amount of money required annually for road repairs will not increase from its current level. So the first question you ask yourself, does this statement affect our conclusion? So if the amount of money required annually decreases or increases, does it affect the revenue? Because remember, the conclusion is about the annual revenue. It's not profit, it's not losses, it's not anything else, it's just revenue. So the money gotten from charging for tolls in this highway. So the amount of money required for road repairs doesn't really affect that annual revenue. So A is insignificant. Can I eliminate? And then B, the total number of trips made on the toll highway per year will not decrease from its current level. So now this is the tricky part, because we see here the total number of trips. So how will the number of trips affect this revenue? So if they increase or if they decrease, will this revenue still increase? Because if the total number of trips decrease, because an assumption is they will not decrease. So if they decrease, the conclusion should fall apart. So, but here notice that, so we have number of trips, so they reduce. So what does the revenue do? So remember that they are increasing 50% increase in the 10 cents per mile toll. So means a driver was paying 10 cents per mile. So now they are paying 15 cents per mile. So this means that if the number of trips reduce and the distance or the average distance per trip remains the same, the revenue will decrease. But if the number of trips decrease and the length, because we are paying per mile, the length increases, the revenue might actually increase by 50%. So there's a chance that even if the total number of trips reduce, that the average length per trip increases. So that means B doesn't affect. It's out. C, the average length of a trip. So this is just the flip of our option B. So if the average length of a trip decreases from its current level, but the total number of trips increase, that means there will be more mileage. That means there will be more revenue. So we can eliminate C. D, the number of drivers consistently avoid the highway tolls by using secondary roads will not increase from its current level. So will not increase. So the ones who avoid the highway. So we have, say, A number of drivers driving on this highway, and say there are 10 who avoid. So if this 10 turns to, say, 20, so we have A minus 10 drivers driving through that road. So there's less drivers driving, but what if those remaining drivers increase the amount of traveling they do? That means that they can actually compensate for these drivers who start avoiding the highway. So as with B and C, D does not necessarily strengthen or weaken these arguments. So it's out. Then E, the total distance traveled by vehicles on the toll highway per year will not decrease from its current level. So we have total distance, and remember that the annual revenue depends on this distance. So if the total distance traveled actually decreases, that means if you have, say, 1,000 miles being traveled, and then this becomes, say, 500, even if you enact this increase, the revenue won't still get here. It will be, say, 5,500 as compared to this, which was 10,000. So you see, these can actually affect, and if the total distance decreases, the conclusion will fall apart because the revenue won't increase. So we have found our assumption. So see now, in this example, we can easily use negation, because if we say the total distance traveled per year will not decrease, we can just remove the not and say the total distance traveled by vehicles per year will decrease. So if it decreases, the revenue goes down, so that weakens. So in this example, it's quite easy to use the negation. But this now requires you to actually not ignore any part of your premise here, because if you ignore this part, you just said 50% increase in toll for vehicles, you would miss the essence of the entire question.
You're watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, presented to you by Upstack America. Upstack America is a consulting company that helps immigrants find amazing higher education and job opportunities in the tech industry in the United States. You can find our programs by going to www.upstackamerica.com. Upstack America, we wake you up to the unlimited potential.
So we have our second question. We can pause, then we'll handle the question. So we have networks of blood vessels in birds' wings serve only to disperse heat generated in flight. This heat is generated only because birds flap their wings. Thus, paleontologists' recent discovery that the winged dinosaur Sandactylus had similar networks of blood vessels in the skin of its wings provides evidence for the hypothesis that Sandactylus flew by flapping its wings, not just by gliding. The argument in the passage relies on which of the following assumption? So remember, we said that assumptions are needed for the conclusion to work. So you see, the argument relies, so means which of the following assumptions? So we have our answer choices. But first, let's look for a conclusion. So what's our conclusion? So thus, the recent discovery that the winged dinosaur had similar networks of blood vessels. So the discovery, provides evidence, this is evidence, that this dinosaur flew by, so of flight, by flapping, not just gliding. So note that the conclusion is not that This dinosaur flew by flapping its wings, not just by gliding. The conclusion is that the discovery of these blood vessels in the skin of its wings is evidence that this dinosaur flew by flapping its wings and not just by gliding. So please take note of that. It's very subtle, but it's important. And then we'll ask ourselves why. So because we have a bird that has same network of vessels that disperse heat generated from flapping. So, and in the case of birds, the blood vessels serve only to disperse heat generated in flight, and this heat generated only because birds flap their wings. So we can say that these vessels just disperse heat generated from flapping their wings. So note the extreme language there, it's very important. So we can move on to answer choices A. Sandactylus would not have had networks of blood vessels in the skin of its wings if these wings were of no use to the dinosaur. So what option A is saying is that there is no way that this dinosaur would have this network of blood vessels if it was of no use. So is this needed for the conclusion to work? Because we are saying that having these blood vessels is evidence that the Sandactylus flew by flapping its wings. So why does it serve as evidence? Because these networks of blood vessels help with cooling. So what if the Sandactylus would actually have these networks of blood vessels, but they didn't serve any purpose? So if that was remotely possible, that means that there is no way that these networks of blood vessels would provide evidence, because if there is any chance that they are of no use to the dinosaur, then we can't use their existence as evidence that this Sandactylus flew by flapping its wings, which means that the vessels were useful for cooling. So A actually sounds like an assumption, so we can keep A. B, all creatures that fly by flapping their wings have networks of blood vessels in the skin of their wings. So we're trying to prove, or we're trying to see if the blood vessels is evidence for flapping wings. This says that all creatures that fly by flapping have networks of blood vessels. It doesn't say that all creatures that have network of blood vessels in the skin of their wings fly by flapping. So it's just the reverse. It's like using the desired result as evidence of the cause. So for that reason, B is out. C, twin dinosaurs that flap their wings in flight would have been able to fly more effectively than winged dinosaurs that could only glide. So if this conclusion had something of the efficiency, so say the efficiency of flight of this dinosaur provides evidence that it flew by flapping its wings, we could have considered C. But our evidence here is just network of blood vessels, not how effectively this dinosaur flew. So for that reason, we eliminate C. D, if the dinosaur flew by flapping its wings, then paleontologists would certainly be able to find some evidence that it did so. So we want to introduce new evidence. We are saying that there's no evidence yet our conclusion is about evaluating if this evidence is valid. So already there is evidence. This does not really make sense. So D is out. D, it generated by Sandactylus and flapping its wings in flight could not have been dispersed by anything other than the blood vessels in its wings. So let's assume for a moment that that the heat generated was able to be dispersed by anything other than the blood vessel. So something else will be able to disperse this heat. Could that mean that we could say that the Syndactylus did not flap its wings? Definitely not, because it doesn't say that if something else, maybe another body part disperses this heat, that wings still do not disperse heat. So if that's the case, then it would be possible that this evidence can still stand, even if the assumption is false. So for that reason, E or the assumption, if it's removed, the conclusion still stands, so we can eliminate E. And so our answer is A. So the thing with this example is that negation is quite difficult because, so say you haven't really understood what the answer choice is saying, and then you try to negate. So say you try to negate option A. So Syndactylus would not have had networks of blood vessels in the skin of its wings if these networks were of no use. So where will you negate? Will you say would have networks of blood vessels in the skin of its wings if these networks were of no use? Or will you say would not have had networks if the networks were of use? So see, you can negate two different parts of the sentence and they result in a completely different meaning. So that's why negating is actually a bit tricky to pull off, especially in complex sentences that have many things that you can negate. So you can negate here, you can negate anything other than. So it's very tricky to use negation sometimes, but just get the flow, the process that you should use when handling assumption questions, and you will be golden. So in summary, what we've said today: one, find the conclusion and make sure that you use the exact wording of the author. Do not ignore any words that are in the premise or any phrases that even seem unimportant. And two, ask yourself why. And three, find an assumption that is actually needed, such that if this assumption is not correct, the conclusion falls apart. So that's it for assumption session today, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.